What would you think if I told you that the moment she no longer clings, he begins to collapse into longing? Not because she changed, not because she punished, but because the gravity of her energy no longer bends itself around his void. In the architecture of the unconscious, there is an ancient dance between the masculine and the feminine. Carl Jung knew this well. The animus and anima, inner representations of the opposite sex, are not merely romantic ideals. They are fragments of the soul, waiting to be integrated. But when a man sees a woman not as herself, but as his anima, his lost inner feminine, he doesn't love her. He projects onto her. He worships her. He needs her, until she steps out of the projection, until she becomes real. That is when the addiction begins. A man is not addicted to the woman who begs. He is not haunted by the woman who stays available. He becomes addicted to the one who sees through him, the one who, in her quiet self-possession, reflects what he lacks: inner peace, emotional depth, and the terrifying beauty of self-reliance. When she stops orbiting his potential and begins to embody her own, the spell breaks for her and begins for him. There is a moment in every woman's journey when the ache of self-abandonment becomes louder than the ache of being unloved, when the fantasy of who he could be no longer justifies the grief of who he is not. That is not cruelty. That is awakening. And the man who once fed on her insecurities, her longing, her softness, offered too soon, he begins to feel a hunger for what he dismissed. You see, he did not fall for her love. He fell for her wounds, the wounds that made her give endlessly, the wounds that made her explain, over-express, over-accommodate. And when those wounds are stitched shut with boundaries, with solitude, with sacred silence, she no longer feels familiar to him. And that unfamiliarity is maddening. There is nothing more threatening to a man trapped in ego than a woman who no longer emotionally negotiates her worth, who no longer seeks permission to exist, who no longer breaks herself open for the sake of understanding. The feminine, when fully embodied, does not beg to be understood. She becomes a force to be reckoned with, not in aggression, but in presence, in the way a mountain simply is, without apology or explanation. And that is what he begins to crave. Not her body, not her laughter, but her mystery. The way she became sovereign without becoming bitter. The way she radiates without needing to reach. The way she disappeared, not physically, but spiritually, from the pedestal he built to feel powerful. You may think that love fades when it is no longer fed, but the truth is more paradoxical. When a woman no longer needs him, she stops leaking energy into illusion. She no longer offers explanations to ears that don't listen. She no longer shows loyalty to chaos just to prove she's not like the rest. And in that withdrawal, she returns to herself. That is the addiction, because she no longer exists to soothe his wounds. She exists to tend to her own garden now, the garden that bloomed in her after the storm he left her in. And though he may try to return, soft words, old promises, echoes of what they once were, she will not be the same. Because the woman who needed him is gone, and in her place stands someone he never truly knew, the woman she was before the world told her to shrink. There's something tragic, almost mythic, about a man who realizes too late that the woman he once overlooked has become untouchable. Not because she moved on to someone else, but because she moved inward. She no longer carries the same scent of longing, the same thirst for being chosen. Something inside her changed, something ancient, something final. He begins to remember her in fragments. The sound of her voice when it was still soft with hope, the way her eyes searched his for reassurance she'd never receive. He remembers the intimacy of her emotional availability, the rawness, the purity, the ache. He remembers it not with gratitude, but with grief, because it is gone now. And nothing he can say, no promises, no performances can bring it back. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, that hidden realm of the psyche where the parts of ourselves we deny or repress are buried. What most men fail to understand is that when they lose a woman who truly loved them, they are not just losing her, they are losing their access to the shadow she held up to them. The mirror, the reflection. She saw them, yes, but more dangerously, she saw through them, through the performances, through the projections, through the armor. In her love, there was danger, because it demanded they face themselves. And many men, especially those who have never done the sacred work of self-confrontation, cannot endure the spiritual intimacy of being truly seen. They would rather feel desired than known. They would rather control than connect. And so when the woman begins to awaken, when her love stops being sacrificial and starts being sovereign, he panics. Not consciously. No, this fear is older than words. It is the fear of being abandoned by the mother, the fear of losing the breast that fed not only the body, but the ego. And so the addiction begins, not to the woman, but to the part of himself that felt whole in her presence, the part that only existed in relation to her validation. Now that she is no longer feeding him that illusion, he finds himself starving, restless, regretful, not because he has changed, but because he has lost the version of himself he liked best, the one reflected in her adoring gaze. But her gaze no longer offers safety. It offers truth. And the truth is, she no longer needs to love him into becoming. She no longer believes in the myth of his potential. She has returned to the realm of reality. And in reality, she sees that her love cannot substitute for his self-awareness, that her patience cannot compensate for his emotional immaturity, that her nurturing cannot rescue the boy who refuses to become a man. This is when he begins to watch her from afar, not just physically, but energetically. He feels her absence as a weight, as a silence that echoes louder than her presence ever did. And he starts to reach out, not out of devotion, but out of desperation. He does not want her. He wants what he was when he had her. You, woman, must understand this. When he reaches back out to you, it is not always love that is speaking. Often, it is addiction. Addiction to your energy, to the way you once made him feel, to the emotional labor you performed without being asked. You carried his unhealed parts like a priestess bearing offerings to the altar of hope. But now, the altar is empty. The rituals have ceased. You have burned the scripts and written a new myth for yourself. And this is the most dangerous kind of power a woman can hold, the power of no longer needing to be chosen. She chooses herself. That choice is not loud. It does not need to be posted or explained. It is in the way she moves through the world now, the way she smiles without waiting to be seen, the way her silence no longer hides sadness, but peace. That is what men remember, not her body, not her words, but her presence, and the abyss it left behind. To the uninitiated man, her absence is a punishment, but to the awakened woman, it is a declaration. It says, I no longer bleed for your awakening. It says, I have withdrawn my light from your shadow. It says, I see now that love, without consciousness, is a beautiful form of self-destruction. This kind of detachment is not coldness. It is alchemy. It is what happens when a woman transforms her heartbreak into wisdom, when she replaces reaction with reflection, when she stops performing worthiness and begins embodying it. The man who once thought her predictable, always forgiving, always reaching, finds himself confused by her calm. He tests her silence like a child pressing on a bruise, hoping the old pain will return so he can feel something familiar. But she has outgrown the wound. He speaks now of memories, of mistakes, of missed opportunities. But what he truly grieves is not the past. It's his inability to control the present. He cannot reach her anymore, not because she has blocked his number, but because she has blocked his access to her nervous system. Her peace is no longer negotiable. Her emotions are no longer his playground, and that is what drives him mad. For many men, need was never love. It was survival. He was not in love with her. He was in love with the feeling of being centered in her world. She made him feel like a king, and he gave her crumbs in return. But now that her crown no longer tilts for him, he is lost. Not because she was his queen, but because she was his mirror. And without her reflection, he has to face the emptiness he once filled with her devotion. Carl Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is the fate of the man who loses a woman he never truly saw. He believes it was timing, or miscommunication, or bad luck. But the truth is simpler and far more devastating. He was not ready to meet himself, and she was the storm that required it. So he runs, or begs, or reappears with borrowed words and performative apologies. But it is not healing he seeks. It is comfort, a return to the space where he was worshipped without being understood. He wants the illusion, not the truth. But the woman she has become is allergic to illusions. She no longer finds meaning in potential. She no longer romanticizes the chase. She is the stillness he cannot seduce. And here lies the root of addiction. Not to her body, not to her voice, but to the feeling of being important in the eyes of someone who made him feel more alive than he ever felt alone. That feeling is not love, it is escape. She was his refuge from his own incompleteness. And now, without her, he must finally feel the emptiness he spent years outsourcing to her attention. You must understand this. The moment a woman stops needing a man is the moment she reclaims her power from him. Not by force, not by bitterness, but by no longer offering her life force to someone who refuses to rise. She no longer explains her worth. She no longer interprets his confusion as mystery. She no longer waits for him to awaken while she quietly suffers in the dark. And this shift, it is spiritual, the kind that rewires the soul. She begins to dream differently, to walk differently, to speak to herself with reverence, no longer waiting for him to define her divinity. And in that freedom, something mystical happens. She becomes more beautiful to him than ever before. Not because she tries, but because she no longer needs him to see it. That's what he wanted all along. A woman who would lose herself in him. And now he is faced with the unbearable truth. The only woman he truly can't forget is the one who remembered herself. By the time he realizes what he's lost, she has already died and been reborn. Not in flesh, but in spirit. The woman he once knew, the one who made herself small so he could feel big, who softened her voice to soothe his ego, who confused emotional labor with love, that woman no longer exists. In her place now stands someone archetypal, almost mythic, the kind of woman Jung called individuated, whole unto herself, no longer fragmented by the need to be wanted. You see, this is the paradox of feminine power. The more she detaches, the more magnetic she becomes. Not because she withholds, but because she no longer seeks. The desperation has died, the chase has expired, and from its ashes she rises with the elegance of one who no longer competes for a place at tables she once built with her own hands. He watches now, closely, silently, from the periphery, from stories, from mutual friends, from digital windows where he scrolls past photos of her not for pleasure, but for penance. The irony is bitter. She is more radiant now, in her absence, than she ever was in her availability. This is the lesson he never wanted to learn. When she gave everything, he felt nothing. When she gives nothing, he feels everything. Because now she is a void. Not empty, but vast. And the masculine fears vastness. It reminds him of the inner ocean he has spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The ocean of feelings he learned to silence, of needs he learned to bury, of pain he learned to project onto women like her. She held that ocean once for both of them. Absorbed his indifference, translated his coldness, interpreted his distance as depth. She made excuses for him when he was just emotionally illiterate. But no more. That era has ended. There is a silence now between them. But not all silence is created equal. Some silence is a weapon. Some silence is a wound. But her silence is sacred. It is the silence of someone who no longer negotiates with what drains her. The silence of someone who found peace in the place she once begged for clarity. And he feels it, deeply, viscerally, in the pit of his stomach, in the middle of the night, when the phone is in his hand but he doesn't call, not because he doesn't want to, but because he knows. On some level, conscious or not, he knows. She's gone. Not from the earth, not from his memories, but from the space he once occupied without gratitude. Jung would say that this is the shadow's reckoning, the return of the repressed. For when a man fails to honor the sacred in a woman, it does not vanish. It waits. And one day, it returns. Not to love him again, but to haunt him. In every woman who will not tolerate his carelessness. In every connection that demands more than performance. In every mirror that reflects the emptiness she once tried to fill. And so, the man becomes a seeker. Not of her, but of what he felt with her. That sense of being known without having to explain. That feeling of home, not in location, but in energy. But here's the twist. No one else can give that back to him. Because what he really longs for is not her, it's himself. The version of himself that only ever surfaced in her presence. But she is no longer a sanctuary for broken men. She no longer wants to be the one who inspires him to grow. That's a job for therapists, not lovers. She no longer wants to carry his mother wound, his father's absence, his fear of failure. She wants a man who has already met himself in the ruins and survived. A man who has faced the dragon within and come back with truth in his hands, not charm on his tongue. And so he is left with a choice. to remain a ghost chasing the echo of her light, or to finally turn inward and become the man she could have met had he arrived whole. Because she is no longer impressed by potential, she is aligned with presence. She does not need fixing or saving or convincing. She needs only what she gives: depth, truth, devotion to inner work. But now she walks ahead, and he watches from behind, not with entitlement, but with reverence. For he now understands what he held and what he lost. And now, in the quiet aftermath, after the longing, the reaching, the late realizations, and the soul-aching regrets, what remains is the most sacred truth of all. She didn't leave to hurt him. She left to heal herself. There is no revenge in her silence, no bitterness in her boundaries. She simply outgrew the life she built inside of him, the soft prison of hope, the exhausting script of proving her worth. She no longer kneels at the altar of almosts. She bows only to truth now, to self-honor, to the fierce grace of knowing she is whole without being chosen. And yet, paradoxically, this is when he desires her most, when she no longer waits, when she no longer tries, when her eyes no longer search for answers in his. This is when he sees her, not through the lens of possession or expectation, but through reverence. The kind of reverence that only comes when something once taken for granted is lost to time and transformation. But it is too late. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because she no longer needs closure from a door she had to learn to close on her own. And that is the final fracture, the realization that the very act of becoming who she was always meant to be required losing him entirely. This, too, is the soul's path. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the highest human calling, not love, not relationship, but the journey back to the self, the reclamation of what was lost in the pursuit of being accepted, of being loved, of being enough. And for the awakened woman, this journey demands sacrifice, the sacrifice of comfort, of illusion, of being wanted for what she gives instead of who she is. And what emerges on the other side is nothing short of sacred. She is not hardened, she is not jaded. She has simply learned the cost of self-abandonment, and she no longer pays it in the name of connection. She has made peace with solitude, not because she prefers to be alone, but because she refuses to be with someone who makes her feel lonely in their presence. She no longer texts first. She no longer over-explains. She no longer rehearses conversations in her head just to avoid disappointing a man who never considered her feelings to begin with. She no longer tolerates emotional crumbs while being expected to serve a feast of unconditional love. And this peace, this quiet power, is what he cannot touch, because it does not seek to be desired. It simply is. It exists without needing to be seen. It breathes without needing to be praised. This is what makes her unforgettable. She has become the woman who no longer asks to be chosen. She chooses her energy. She chooses her wholeness. She chooses her soul. And in doing so, she becomes a mirror once more. Not to him, but to every woman still waiting for a man to make her feel like enough. She becomes a symbol, a flame, a call to return home to herself. Because the truth is, love is not meant to cost you your sanity. It is not meant to fracture your identity or demand your silence. Love, when mature and conscious, does not come from need. It comes from overflow. From two whole beings choosing to walk together, not to complete each other, but to witness each other's fullness. She knows this now. She has walked through fire and come out made of gold, not the polished kind, but the raw, wild gold of self-respect. She no longer chases anything that costs her that. And he will remember her. Not just in memory, but in absence. In every half-hearted love that fails to ignite him. In every quiet moment where he realizes he was never truly present with her. And now she is everywhere and nowhere at once. Because when a woman no longer needs him, he becomes addicted. Not to her body, not to her words, but to the version of himself that he only ever met in her light. But that light has gone home now, back to its source, back to her. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.